I'm Chris Funk, and I was appointed to the first commission, Lincoln-Lancaster Women's Commission, in 1976. Now, was it 1975? It's okay. 1976 here, it says. Oh, okay, so we'll start over. So,
you know what? I'm glad we're starting over because I just want to be a little better.
You were ready? So now you're like, oh,
I was ready, but then I realized it looks slightly better if the camera was like that. Okay, now this time.
We're ready.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got involved.
Okay. I'm Chris Funk, and I was appointed to the first Lincoln-Lancaster Commission on the Status of Women in 1976. Helen Bucelis was looking for diversity on the commission, and she wanted somebody young, and at that time I was 25 or 26, I guess. So the man who had run her campaign for mayor was a good friend of my sister's, and so he asked me if I would be interested, and of course I was wildly interested in serving.
Great.
And then within a year or so, the grant I was on at Child Guidance ended, and I needed work, and the commission was looking for money to hire a director, and they got CETA money. And those funds allowed me and another woman to start actually staffing the commission. So I was also the first director.
And so how long were you the director?
About 5.5 years, I think.
Great. Well, okay, so tell us about the early years and what were some of the things that were going on and what did women need to be involved in?
Well, you know, it was probably one of the most exciting times to be on the commission because all the issues were needing attention. There was nothing that didn't need attention. And there was a consciousness about it, and there were people ready to speak up and people ready to listen and people ready to act. And so it was a very exciting time. And and there were issues that we were all learning about. You know, we didn't all have understanding of everything from whether it was displaced homemakers to the issues of childcare, sexual harassment, employment, education, media issues, sexual stereotyping. There was, I mean, you name it, we found a place to talk about it and do something about it.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about what were some of the early actions that were things that you were involved in.
My first involvement with the commission was I ended up chairing the health committee, and we had the main couple things we did was we held health conferences for women and started to talk about a lot of issues that women hadn't really been able to openly talk about with their health or to have information about. We also took up the issue of natural birthing units, and that was the first involvement of issues that I had. And then as a commission, when I became the director, then many more issues started, and I became involved in a broader perspective. Employment was something we spent time on, looking at sexual harassment in the workforce, educating people about that. I remember I did a workshop for the City of Lincoln supervisors on sexual harassment along with the Human Rights Commission, and there were incredibly sexist statements made in that among supervisors. One man said, well, my secretary, you know, wears very revealing blouses, and how did he say it? Something about it's my right to do this. One man said, well, it's my right to, you know, say what I want to. And women ask for whatever they get by what they wear. When Helen heard about this and that word got back to her, she was livid and put out a whole other message to city supervisors about their attitudes and behavior. So I also worked with some railroad women who were being severely harassed. These were laborers. These women did really hard work on the railroad, and they would get into these tanks and scrub them out, and it was very dirty, hard labor. And almost all of them were on Valium because they were so traumatized by the harassment, and the men would walk in on them in the showers, and they constantly referred to their bodies, and it was just the worst harassment I'd ever seen. And they came to us to get help, and we provided, I think some good advocacy. But we also helped them address problems with their union, because the union was not dealing effectively with it, and the men were also met. Long story short, the women took on some of the issues with the union, and in a big showdown meeting with them, they were elected to be the officers of the union. So it went from them being severely harassed to the men actually electing them to be leaders of their union. It was that was quite an amazing group of women who taught me a lot. And sex role stereotyping was a big issue everywhere we went, and we would look for places where we saw, particularly publications of official kinds, of what they were saying about men and women, girls and boys often. The state health department had a publication called Pierre the Pelican, and Pierre would tell parents what were the appropriate toys for boys and what were appropriate for girls and what would be the appropriate behaviors for boys and girls, So we communicated about that, and I think they did finally retire Pierre. There was Goodrich, I think, had T-shirts that had jugs on them that were really, very sexist, and so we took opportunities where we could find it to point out those things. Didn't require a big committee, we'd send some letters and see what came back. But we really have probably some of our biggest efforts were really centered around legislation, state legislation. And while there was federal legislation being passed that, like Title IX, which ensured for equality in education, the states had to implement those federal laws, and in Nebraska's case and in many states they weren't doing that very well. So we decided that we really needed to have a state Title IX. And we organized quite an effort to do that, and a grassroots lobbying effort. One of our, we had packets of information, and on the front of the packet was a picture of this little girl who was the daughter of one of our commissioners holding a basketball, and she's really darling little girl with blonde hair and this big basketball. And one of the senators who saw this got up on the floor of the legislature and he said, "My sister played basketball, and do you know she never had children?" And it was like, oh my God. We couldn't believe our ears, and so a lot of us joked that we were now going to start a campaign of basketball for birth control, and that this would be this would be the answer to everything. But actually, he kind of did us a favor, because he embarrassed him. A lot of senators were very embarrassed by this, and in fact, we passed it. Now, I don't know that that was the full reason, but I think it actually sort of helped. But that kind of tells you what the views were and how openly people were saying things like that. Let's see, what were some other I think one of the important things for people to know about, or for the history of what happened particularly in the 70s when I was engaged, was that in Nebraska we worked in coalition with many women's organizations. And in fact, when I left to go to graduate school at the University of Massachusetts, and in 1981, and I had a friend who was the director of the Cambridge Women's Commission, and she said, "I want you to come and talk to the women's groups here in Boston about what you all do in Nebraska and working together." And so I did. I went and gave a presentation when I got there, and they were really pretty flabbergasted, because they all worked independently. They did not have a collaborative effort. And I think that really is one of the, I don't know what happened in all the other states, but I think in Nebraska that was one of the reasons that we had the successes that we did.
What were some of the other groups that you worked with?
The State Women's Commission, obviously.
Sorry, could you start with the State Women's Commission?
Yeah. The State Women's Commission, of course, and they did a tremendous amount of research. They had professional staff. They had an attorney on board who did a lot of publications and research work. BPW, Business and Professional Women's Groups, and they had a number of chapters. And there was Nova BPW was one that really stood out as an activist chapter. And AAUW, American Association of University Women, the YWCA, the Nebraska Coalition for Women, which was actually formed to be a little stronger, have a stronger voice than what the state government commissions could have on some issues that were somewhat more controversial, and to be a little more political. And anyway, those are the groups that come to mind right away, but I'm sure there were others. But those groups were strong then. BPW was strong, AAUW was strong, YWCA was strong. Women were far more involved and engaged in a broad spectrum of organizations than I think they are today. So one of the things we did, well, several things we did. One of the best projects, I think, was what we called Adopt a Senator program. And that came out of efforts of the coalition and the legislative caucus. And we identified, all of our groups had women across the state who lived in different senators' districts. And we asked women to adopt their senator. So maybe you'd get 5 or 6 women in a legislative district, and they would get to know the senator, and they would be the ones to carry the message and to, create a presence. And it was quite successful. We had workshops and trainings on how to work with your senator, how to lobby, how to, all that. It was, I know another major group was WIFE, the Women in Farm Economics group, and they were critical, particularly with rural senators on a number of our issues. But that was a unique initiative and program, and I think helped get through a number of pieces of legislation. One of the big bills that we had that we were also very proud of, we called it the Lazy Bankers Bill. And this was a bill where people own property in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, mostly married couples. And when one person dies, the other person inherits that property free of the separate debts of their deceased spouse. Well, this was a bill that would have allowed a spouse or one of the land partners to mortgage the property without the permission of the other party, so one senator described it to me. He said, well, Chris, this is just so farmers don't have to be embarrassed to go home and get their wives to sign their loans. And I was like, I repeated this to him, just as he said it, kind of like, so this is, as I repeated it, I could see the look on his face that he realized who he was talking to, that I was representing women's interests. So we caught this bill late. The State Women's Commission caught it late because they were doing they were the ones that brought it to our attention. And it might have been the Women in Farm Economics group. I don't know who spotted it, but most of us weren't looking at banking bills. That wasn't, where most of our attention was. So the bill had already gotten onto select file. Very hard to stop. But the WIFE group had a telephone tree network, and they started calling senators every 15 minutes. They got a call from another woman in their district until they changed their votes. It was great. And one meeting, Donna Carnes, who was I don't know if at the time she was the chair, but she was an attorney and active on the commission and very active on this issue. She and I met with the banking lobby at the Village Inn at 27th and O. I'll always remember where we were. And to talk about this legislation, and they said, so what's it going to take for you to call off your dogs? And we were just flabbergasted, like, are you kidding? We were so excited that we were having that sort of impact. And I don't know what we said, but probably something to the effect that, they're not being called off. And we won it. We won, thanks to a number of things, including running chambers. But it was a great example, really, of a lot of different pieces that it took, to come together for that to happen.
And you were excited you had dogs.
And we were excited we had dogs, yeah. Everybody was just hooted.
We have dogs?
We have dogs. Oh my God. We have dogs, the bankers. And we were told this was the first time anyone had beaten the banking lobby. So we felt pretty good. And, you know, I don't think that was ever offered up again as a piece of legislation. But there were so many things, and ideas that were new to people, new to senators, you know, like childcare. Those two words, childcare, were not uttered by these lawmakers. They only would refer to it as babysitting. And they couldn't get it. It was a real hard concept for them to get. It was, I think of all the issues that we talked about, childcare seemed to have the hardest time for public policy people to see the value of it and to understand it. And
what did you do in the area of childcare?
well, we did. Some had to do with regulation because there was an awful lot of childcare that was unregulated, and so we worked on getting standards, and we did a lot of work for a while with businesses, helping them survey their employees to find out what the needs were, and talking about options that employers had to help support childcare. We tried to get a childcare center established in the center and garage. Helen was really big on that. And I don't remember, it had to do, I think, with the funding source that couldn't help put it there or something. We had some commissioners whom you may interview that worked on a project called Time Out, and they would provide childcare for women who needed time out, you know, and they would schedule a, you know, time that they could take their kids in. So it was more of a drop-in kind of thing as opposed to you have to pay this every month or every, you know. And those are the main things I remember, but I certainly remember any time we were before the legislature or policymakers, they could not call it childcare. So the other one that was really new to people, and it was all had been hushed up, was domestic violence. And that was not an issue that people had been comfortable talking about publicly. And we brought in a woman, I remember Del Martin came in, who was a national writer on this subject, and boy did she open the eyes of a lot of people. And it was both domestic violence and rape, both rape and spouse abuse that were kind of hand in hand, that we tried to work on those issues, talk to the police about how they treated victims, looking for, and at that time, when I started on the commission, I don't think there was any crisis line, any shelters. Those things were all unheard of. And a lot of it had, as we developed those things, was also getting the word out to women that those services were available, you know. And it has continued to grow. I mean, even today, I know that Friendship Home directors told me that they have a waiting list that they could have another shelter, you know. So I don't know that we've done a very good job of reducing violence. We've done a better job at identifying it and helping victims and giving them assistance.
What about the Displaced Homemaker Act?
Yeah, you know, that was also a new concept. And as more couples were getting divorced and women had stayed home and raised families, and then their husbands divorced them, or there they are, and they don't have a way to support themselves. And I think part of it, the laws changed pertaining to no-fault divorce, and there wasn't automatic alimony, and so a lot of women, divorced women, were really finding themselves in serious poverty situations. So there was a federal act passed that recognized that and tried to provide a variety of support. And we worked to get the YWCA to have the Displaced Homemaker Center housed at their facility. And there was counseling and training and different kinds of support services for women who found themselves in that situation. Credit and insurance, now that was another big one that a lot of us, you know, I really didn't have a good handle on that or understand that. And there was a woman who was an insurance agent, Judy Wesley, who really educated a lot of us about how bad the laws were pertaining to that and why it was important for women to establish credit in their own name. And a lot of women would lose it when they would get married. I mean, those were some of the laws that had to change, that women could establish credit in their own name and keep it even when they got married. And we had to do battle, as you heard from others, about getting our names in the phone book if we were married. So it just seemed like there was hardly a subject matter that you can think of that wasn't on the table at some point. You know?
Right. So when you think about the kinds of progress that has been made, where do you think that we've made the most progress, and where do you think we still need to work?
Well, clearly, education, we've made tremendous progress. That Equality and Education Act went way beyond what I think anybody ever imagined, you know, that where they really couldn't keep girls out of shop class or, you know, math. It just, the whole system changed, and athletics, of course, which was a big one, which a lot of people think about Title IX specifically in terms of sports, but it had far-reaching impact in academically, you know. And I think we've really done well in women, girls and women having access to the full range of education, and they're demonstrating what they want to do with it, you know, when you look at the graduate schools and the higher education. So that's good. And along with that has come better earnings. Although there's still traditional female jobs that are not well paid, and that's a complicated issue. I actually spent a lot of time on that in Comparable Worth, but it's a longer interview than what this can do. So education, employment, general laws pertaining to things like sexual harassment, and certainly, even though, as I said before, I'm not sure we've reduced violence that much. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it sometimes. But we certainly have better services for women, protection for them and their children, and we have the laws pertaining to credit and insurance. I think a lot of that, those things that allow people to move equally in society, I think we've done. And I think it's a really good question about where are the gaps? And I don't know there are some things pertaining to employment, I think still that came up recently with how long it could be before someone could file a claim on employment discrimination. I don't know, do you remember that federally? That was, well, anyway. I've actually tried to think a lot about what would we do now if the commission existed again? Where would we focus our attention? And I do see violence and rape, both domestic and date rape and that sort of thing, continues to be an astonishingly profound, astonishingly prolific problem. You know, and I think we need to think a lot more about that, why that is, and probably work a lot more with men and culture and families about that. And we didn't do much of that when we were early on. Men weren't highly included in our work. And I think it requires men being part of it too, you know. But it's in this day and age, this should not be happening. But it is happening, and it's happening around the world. And you know, girls are getting acid thrown in their face or shot for trying to seek an education. So that part needs to change. And I think the more we can work to bring women's economic status up, they still tend to be the primary child care providers. Often they're single parents, the single parent, and trying to help address that issue.
the wage gap and all of that is really hard to tackle.
You know, and I went to the labor program. I decided to get a master's in labor studies after I worked with these women on the railroad, and I worked with the nurses here in Lincoln that organized at Bryan. I was around for that and helped them a little bit. And I was there at the meeting where they announced that management had, when they inquired as to why the janitorial and groundskeepers made more money than nurses that were high skill working in cardiac or chemo. And by the way, women nurses were maybe made 50 cents more an hour after being there 10 years. They were told that those people were skilled workers. So this was like 1980, we're talking about, somewhere in there. I was at that meeting where the union organizers, who themselves were nurses, and said, here's the deal, this is what they're telling us, and are we going to stop this effort? And there was just this resounding no. They voted to form a union. They had an 80% vote for it. And when I went to the labor program, and unions were not doing well nationally at all, and an 80% vote, it was something like that. I don't want to be quoted, but it was very high. They were just blown away by what a strong effort that was. So my thought, and of course I didn't know much about unions really in labor, I thought, well, that's the next thing I can do is help women organize and be part of organized labor. And but it isn't as simple as that. And the laws pertaining to unions are not always, are not particularly supportive of what I would call workplace democracy, which really became more of my interest as I was in the program and studying labor issues. They're very hard laws that continue to have a very strong separation between management and labor, and a lot of rules. And I don't know. I'm not sure that it's going to work to get for the labor. In some places it will, but a lot of places I don't think it's work. It's hard to get the union vote. There's a lot of problems in getting there and a lot of barriers. In fact, I came back from the labor program and in a summer in between semesters, and I was going to help the nurses with their bargaining. And the day we were to sit down to bargain, the hospital sent word that they had signatures of 12 people who said that they didn't believe the union represented everybody. Something like, just some ridiculous thing like that. Based on that, they were legally able to pull out of bargaining. And it took years for the National Labor Relations Board to resolve that conflict. Of course, they found in favor of the nurses union, but by that time, things had fallen apart more. So it's that kind of, when you see that going on, this is a very hard road to go to get women to be able to have higher paying jobs that they deserve.
Lots of institutional things that are against.
Very, and it's so hard to do. And I worked a lot on the issue of comparable worth, actually quite extensively on that issue. And once again, it's an extremely hard issue to get any movement on.
Maybe to think about, I think anyway, is that women still self-select into the kinds of professions that aren't really high paying.
Right.
So the wage gap will always be there as long as women choose to work in fields in which they're not paid a really high salary. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if that's what they want to do, and if that's what they feel motivated to do, who are we to tell them, don't be that? On the other hand, maybe the difficult thing is to get those kinds of positions more well paid in a culture in which those are not as well valued.
That's right. I think, and in some ways, if women choose not to do that, to go other places, it'll be harder to fill those jobs, and they'll start to pay more too. I was recently in Las Vegas at restaurant in a hotel where the waiters were men, and I said to Ken, I said, well, this is a unionized place. He said, why do you say that? I said, because the waiters are men, and they're older men. And later I said, is this union? He said, absolutely, you know. So even when you unionize a traditionally female occupation, then more men come into it, which is okay. But so the women were getting, it wasn't all men. There were, but more men than you usually see waiting tables in a restaurant in a hotel. You know?
Yeah.
So, and I think the other really important part is schools and what kind of counseling and education we're giving girls and where we're encouraging them to go. And certainly math and science is an area that girls still tend to be steered away from, or they think that, you know, they don't have a stronger capacity, which in fact is wrong, they do. That's starting to improve a bit and change. But I don't know. I mean, I would really welcome a really good discussion among interested parties again about what do we do, or how do we help elevate human consciousness. I mean, it isn't just about women. It is about all of human relations and all of our, collective selves and how we live respectfully together and honor each other, and I do think the women's movement was a huge move up, and it had been building, for decades, if not centuries. But we were really lucky, a really exciting time to be part of that, and it's more challenging in some ways now.
But what is the difference now? I mean, it seems like, 40 years later, 40 years later, we're now seeing what we feel is some backpedaling or some sliding back down.
Oh, yeah.
To what?
Certainly.
To what do
reproductive
you?
rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you accredit that to? Do you think?
Religion. I do. I think a lot of that has to do with very, highly organized religion. And, back in '76, when the International Women's Year was happening, and we were all part of that, and that was Jimmy Carter had called this for women for all states to hold these conventions to talk about what issues needed to come forward and what federal government and society needed to do. It was a really big deal. And we had our convention out at the East Campus. The word got out among really conservative Christian churches that this was happening, and they bussed people from all across Nebraska and packed the place, and had a slate of candidates. We had the votes for the policy, but we didn't slate our candidates, so we didn't get them, and they got all the candidates, and they went to represent Nebraska. So back then, there was huge pushback from, I think, mostly from the religious right, and I still think that. I mean, I worked, following the commission's work, the state commission in Lincoln-Lancaster. I was at Planned Parenthood for 21 years, so I saw very closely who was fighting against us on basic birth control, sex education, and of course abortion. And it was the Catholic Church and really fundamentalist Protestant churches. So that's my take. I don't know, I'm sure other people have different views about who else has a self-interest in this. And I don't see corporations so much, or businesses so much, having that, because more women are in businesses and are leaders. It really is changing, I think. And I'm sure there are some people, I'd be interested to hear from young women today what the work environment is like. Are they getting harassed? Are they, do they sense sexism? I don't have an ear for that anymore. I mean, the channels aren't open, and I don't know if women are talking about that anymore. And I think it would be good, it would be very good to get younger women together to hear their their views.
And maybe that's the key, is that at the time when all of this got going in the late 70s and early 80s, there were a lot of women coming together and there were these collaborations.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't seem that there's that kind of momentum for organization or of camaraderie that there was. And
I think that's absolutely right.
And yet, I think in the last election, the social media stuff really kind of united people of like mind.
Mm-hmm.
And they had an opportunity to hear that there were others out there thinking and feeling the same way that they did. And maybe that is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, and there may be, I do think the way that younger people and a lot of people communicate now, they're much more networked to a much broader array of people. I'm not sure that it provides the same depth of discussion and analyzing and, because it's fast and kind of sound bites. But it's, what people are doing, so you kind of have to work with where you're at. But I think, that would be a great thing for the commission to do today, is to start to convene groups of younger women to hear what they're saying. What are they experiencing? What do they need? And then I think poverty generally, just the whole issue of economics and poverty continue to be largely women and children's issues. Not that men aren't in poverty, they are, but because women often continue to be the primary caretakers of children, poverty affects them more dramatically. And there, I think we still have to look at the broader issues of economics, and I'm not sure everybody's on board with that, in terms of what kind of economic structures make sense for society. Not just discriminatory to women, or people of color, but just generally, what are the, how is this working for people, Do we have a middle class anymore? What's the gap that's going on between the super rich and the poor is growing? And trying to talk about those and think about those issues, my gut tells me is where we find the answers to having women, have a better place at the table.
That'll be very difficult to bring about those discussions.
Very difficult. It's very difficult. People don't want it. Most people don't want to hear them. I was at a few years ago at something in Lincoln. I forget why I was invited to be part of this discussion, and it was about economics. I just simply brought up about worker-owned industries because that was something I studied, which is a very common thing. I mean, Ideal Grocery has been worker-owned. Many of the airlines are worker-owned. There were people literally who suggested I was speaking about communism. I was like, what? So yeah, it's tough. It's very tough.
When you get that communism thing slapped in your face.
Oh my God,
That's going to kind of put a kibosh on the discussion.
Just a bit, it's like, what? I don't know. But I do think democratization of work sites, of communities, where all people have the ability for greater involvement and input, will create a more equal society.
So what advice would you give to young women today?
Sorry, there's one weird thing going on with the camera.
What
It
is that?
says it's overheating, which
Oh,
is
weird.
extremely weird. I'm gonna have
Talia?
It's back, it's fine.
It's back. See, I do really think you don't realize how much heat is generated in here.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's really crazy.
I
I love the windows.
I do, yes, and I'm sure, particularly in the winter, it's fabulous.
And it's so nice to have the light, but it's just that it's very hot there. So where did I just asked about advice.
Right.
Advice for young women. What would you advise them to do? That's our question. Are we ready to go?
Yes.
Are you on?
Yes.
Okay, she's on.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what advice would you give to young women today?
To really be open to options for themselves and look at careers that maybe they haven't thought or are typical for women. Although I'm not sure that, I don't know how many girls are doing that anymore. But certainly to absolutely pursue education and economic self-sufficiency. Very, very important to think about, and to, as well as to continue to give back to society and look for ways. I think women really need to continue to be, and I would encourage them to be engaged in social and civic issues. I really wish we had more women in Congress and the Senate. It's a pretty nasty place to be right now, but we do not have enough women running for office. That's probably, when you look at, you've got all these women lawyers and all these doctors, but the one area that's still very thin is public policy and leadership. And to look at what you need, to do that and to develop your skills for it. I think women are far more accepted in public life, obviously, than they used to be. But there sure is some seats that need to be filled.
Why do you think that is?
It may be what the nature of political campaigning is. It's very tough, and I know this from personal involvement and experience. It is very hard to be a candidate, and you have to raise money, and you have to have a tough skin, and it is not a pleasant process by and large. And it may be that women don't want to put themselves through that. I don't know. I don't know. I've thought a lot about that, why they're not running, or oftentimes, certainly in Nebraska, being a state legislator doesn't pay you anything, and you may not have the luxury of having a job that allows you to not work for several months out of the year, or I don't know. I think that's a good question to research, actually, and find out what's going on. And the good thing is, I know that the commission and other groups have worked on helping women get ready to run. I think that's really important. It may just be that women haven't been exposed to that very much. It's not something they teach in school. If they haven't been around people who run for office, they may not have any idea of what that's like. Women certainly can do it, and they do it, and do it very well. So that's something I would really like to encourage more women and young women to be engaged in public policy. Starting in school, being involved in school government is probably a very good place to learn about government and governance and running for office and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Anything else you'd want to say?
No, it's been a great journey. I feel really lucky. The people, the women I got to work with through the years has just been exhilarating, And the diversity of women, women from all kinds of backgrounds who came together on this journey. It was really, I just feel honored, frankly. I kind of fell into it, It wasn't like something, I'm going to plan out, I'm going to do this. It just kind of happened. And so I always felt a little like, I'm kind of lucky to be here.
Well, everybody was lucky to have you too. That's for sure.
Well, it was a great, tremendous experience. So.
One thing we haven't talked about much is the civil rights movement.
Yes.
Did you feel like the civil rights movement fueled the women's movement?
The women's movement started, back on its own, aside from the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, in the early 1900s. So in some ways it started before working to get the right to vote. And that effort to work to get the vote, I think really really laid the groundwork for all the other activism that came. And I think it happened that the real intensity of the women's movement and the civil rights movement came pretty close together in the 60s and 70s and even 80s. I don't know that one fueled the other. It almost seemed like they arrived together on the same maybe different trains on the same platform or something. And they were complimentary. But, you know, there was people who were people of color who were working on civil rights issues, you know, felt that's where they belonged, and women maybe who weren't of color that, you know, felt like they needed to work on women's commissions. But I always felt like there was great support for each other, you know, even though we weren't all overlapping. But many times, conversations, speeches included both, you know. I think in Lincoln, we felt often that we didn't have enough women of color as part of our effort, and that we needed to help address those issues, or help bring women, open our work so that we were inclusive, more inclusive. And that was a struggle sometimes to do that.
And maybe because they were working on
They
other
were in
issues.
part working on other issues, and maybe in part they didn't feel that they were welcomed. I don't know. But there certainly was overlap, and we certainly did have connections with, like the NAACP, and I don't know if there was a specific women's group. Yeah, but there were connections, certainly.
That's great.
But probably could have been more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.